Hello everyone, and welcome to the lost world of Cape Breton Island. In parts 1 and 2 of our episode about the Acadian folk song La Complainte de Louisbourg, we covered how and where this traditional ballad was first recorded. We then analyzed its contents historically to see how it stood up against the events captured in its lyrics. In part 3 of our podcast about La Complainte de Louisbourg, we look at how this song might have found its way to the village of Chéticamp, Nova Scotia. You were listening to a recording of La Complainte de Louisbourg, made by folklorist Helen Creighton in Saint-Joseph-du-Moine on Cape Breton Island.
On t'y croit, yes, imprenable, mais tu n'as plus résisté.
Hidden within the vast catalogue of traditional songs from Chéticamp, we find La Complainte de Louisbourg. The song refers to the 1745 siege of Louisbourg from the standpoint of Governor Louis Dupont du Chambon. The lyrics are incredibly detailed, including vivid descriptions that point to an eyewitness to those events. It even goes so far as to list the precise honours of war afforded to the French garrison in the final terms of surrender. Despite there being several Acadian communities on Cape Breton Island today, such as those on Île Madame, whose history actually does overlap with that of Louisbourg's, this lament seems to have originated solely with the Acadians from the region of Chéticamp.
Il demande aux 20 hommes que cherchez-vous ici. Nous cherchons à nous battre, vive le jour. Il faut nous battre ici, vive la fleur de lys. Nous cherchons.
Today, only a 3-hour drive separates the towns of Chéticamp and Louisbourg. When looking at a map of Cape Breton Island, one might make the assumption that their histories dovetailed nicely, that these places must be old familiar acquaintances. Interestingly enough, this is not the case. In a historical sense, these two settlements are practically strangers. For example, the language spoken in Chéticamp would have been somewhat different than what you would hear on the streets of Louisbourg. The Acadians of Chéticamp had their own dialect or patois, which would more than likely differ from the French spoken in Louisbourg. Also, the town of Chéticamp was founded in 1785. By this time, Louisbourg, as a French fortified town, had ceased to exist. As the first wave of settlers stepped onto the shores of Chéticamp, the only things left of the once magnificent town of Louisbourg was a handful of dilapidated houses standing in what used to be a busy intersection, and by 1782, mostly inhabited by English families. In the years leading up to the final disconnect between the Acadians and France, their relationship had grown stale. So although the answer to how this traditional song came to exist in Chéticamp seems simple enough, there is more to it than meets the eye. During the first half of the 18th century, the fault line between the colonial empires of Great Britain and France ran through Canada's maritime region, the modern-day provinces of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. During those years, these borderlands existed in an almost continuous state of unrest, frequently erupting in skirmishes, raids, and clashes, regardless of whether or not the countries were at war. At the end of each officially declared war that involved the Maritimes, the French would lose another piece of their traditional colonial claims. France would officially cede mainland Nova Scotia to the British in 1713. This would be followed by the occupation of Île Royale and Île Saint-Jean in 1758. Then finally New France in its entirety in 1763. Chaos ensued in the wake of those receding borders, and the Acadians were caught in the middle. In the years following their expulsion at the hands of the British in 1755, some Acadians would attempt a return to the regions which their families had previously settled before the expulsion, while others decided to forge new realities. The area, now known as Chéticamp, on the northwest coast of Cape Breton Island, was founded in 1785 by those Acadians searching for a new beginning. The location of Chéticamp is telling. Wedged between the Cape Breton Highlands on one side and the Gulf of St. Lawrence on the other. These were clearly a group of people who wanted to be left alone, far from any future potential fighting between France and England. It is hard to believe that Cape Breton Island had once been a battleground for the French and English during the 1740s and 1750s, and then an offshore battleground for the American, French, and British navies in the 1770s and 1780s. The location of their new settlement, Chéticamp, ensured that whatever changes might come upon Cape Breton Island in the future, these Acadians would not be affected. At least two direct links exist between the towns of Chéticamp and Louisbourg: Jeanne Dugas and Joseph Gaudet, some of the very first settlers to the Chéticamp area. Jeanne Dugas was born in Louisbourg on October 16, 1731, to an Acadian family originally from Grand Pré, Nova Scotia. Historian Anne-Marie Lane Jonah says the following about Jeanne's upbringing. Jeanne lived in the cosmopolitan port town of Louisbourg until she was about 10 to 12 years old. Her family moved back to mainland Nova Scotia, Acadia, possibly to avoid the coming strife as war approached in the mid-1740s. This move began what would be for Dugas a lifetime of peregrinations that took in the entire maritime region. Avoiding war, fleeing expulsion, being captured and imprisoned, resettling and then resettling again. The journey for Jeanne and her husband Pierre Bois ended more than 40 years later, in 1785, when they were among the first families to settle the Acadian village of Chéticamp in western Cape Breton. Her older brother, Joseph Dugas, experienced much of the same hardships throughout his life. Born in Grand Pré, Nova Scotia in 1714, he was an eyewitness to many of the pivotal moments in the history of the Maritimes. After living in Ile Royale for almost 3 decades, he fled to Quebec after the final surrender of Louisbourg in 1758, was imprisoned in Halifax in 1761, settled in Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon after his release, and then was finally deported to Saint-Malo, France in 1778, only to pass away within a few months of arriving. The lives of both Joseph and his sister Jeanne typify the reality of what life was like on the Acadian frontier in the 18th century. Joseph Dugas was an extremely active figure in Louisbourg's commercial life throughout his 3 decades in Ile Royale. At age 15, he was the captain of a small merchant ship, and then along with his father, he supplied the garrison of Louisbourg with firewood. Historian Bernard Pautier, speaking about this contract, says, between 1730 and 1737, the annual income from this business averaged 5,567 livres, phenomenal earnings compared with a garrison captain's pay of only 1,080 livres. Industrious and capable, in May of 1745, with the New England troops already digging into the hills above Louisbourg Harbour, Governor du Chambon would task Dugas with the urgent mission of traveling to Nova Scotia and locating Paul Marat de la Malgue and his Canadian and Mi'kmaq troops in order for them to come to Louisbourg's assistance. Although it is unclear if Dugas was able to return to Louisbourg before its surrender on June 28, when he did eventually return, William Pepperell, Commander-in-Chief of the New England forces occupying Louisbourg, and Commodore Peter Warren used him in much the same capacity as did Governor du Chambon. Joseph Dugas' experiences afforded him a unique view of what was transpiring in Nova Scotia during the years leading up to the declaration of war between Great Britain and France. The 1752 census tells us that Joseph Dugas was finally reunited with his sister Jeanne and her husband Pierre Bois in Port-Toulouse, present-day St. Peter's, Nova Scotia, after Ile Royale was returned to the French at the end of the war. Looking at Dugas' close involvement with the French and English governments in Louisbourg just before and directly after its capture, it is possible that Joseph Dugas could have been the eyewitness that inspired La Complainte de Louisbourg. The details of the siege of 1745 could have subsequently been shared with his sister Jeanne and her husband Pierre. In turn, they would have taken that information through their sojourns and finally to Chéticamp, where they made their final home in the 1780s. Another link exists between Chéticamp and Louisbourg with the family of Joseph Gaudet. The 1818 census of Chéticamp reveals that two of Joseph Gaudet's sons, Maximilien and Louis, were born in Louisbourg about 1761 and 1769 respectively. As to how long the family was actually living in Louisbourg during its final years as a town is unclear, and I would be very interested in knowing more about this part of their story, should anyone have additional information on the topic. Joseph Gaudet was born in Nova Scotia around 1736, making him around 9 years old at the time of the first siege. There is a possibility that once he married and moved to Louisbourg, he obtained enough of the story of the first siege to piece together what had happened and brought that information with him to Chéticamp later in life. The story of how la Complainte de Louisbourg came to be is still somewhat unknown, but two very strong possibilities exist as to how the information contained in his verses arrived in the quiet, idyllic region of Chéticamp, Nova Scotia. Firstly, Jeanne Dugas and her husband Pierre Bois, and secondly, the family of Joseph Gaudet. Perhaps its source of information is this elusive eyewitness to the long-lost colony of Ile-Royale, or perhaps it is the product of this eyewitness's grandchildren, or even great-grandchildren, preserving their ancestors' words in song. It is our hope that one day, the entire story of this song will finally come to light. We will end part 3 of this episode by listening to a bit more of La Complainte de Louisbourg, recorded in 1944 by Helen Creighton.
Manque de canon, de poudre et d'ammunition. En garnison 20 000 hommes, nous avions tant de secours. Mais je voudrais savoir comment a-t-il pris Philippsburg. Les Anglais, soir et matin, animés par leur dauphin.